My name is Michael. I passed away 3 months ago. My departure may seem early by the standards of our country, but it happened at the exact time that Jesus Christ called me. I had painful moments on earth, but He delivered me from all of them. I was 52 years old, and the deliverances Jesus gave me were beautiful. He came at the right time and set me free. I was called at the time that had been prepared for me to live by His side. Now, Jesus Himself will tell each of the stories of deliverance. Take this opportunity to subscribe to this channel so that every day our Jesus can share stories of how He saved His children from death.
I'm Jesus Christ, your Savior, your Shepherd, and the author of life. This is the story of Michael, a man born in a quiet corner of California, far from the noise of the world, but never far from my eyes. From the very moment he took his first breath, I walked beside him. Even when he could not see me, I was there. Michael's life was not without storms. He faced danger, loss, and moments where death came close enough to breathe on his neck. But I held him. Again and again, I reached into the chaos and pulled him back, not because he was perfect, but because he was mine. You see, every day of Michael's life was written in my book, even before one of them came to be. And not one of those days could be taken from him. I did not allow death to claim him until the day I had already set, when his race was run and his purpose complete. These are the moments I intervened. 7 times I saved him. Not to spare him from pain, but to preserve his journey, to shape his heart, and to bring him home. In my perfect timing, come and see how I loved him. Come and see the hand of the Savior in a man's quiet, courageous life. I was there before anyone else entered that room. Before the doctors, the nurses, or even his mother realized the weight of the moment, I was already present. The sterile air of the delivery room was thick with quiet tension, though no one could name it yet. On that cold winter morning in Northern California, Michael was about to enter the world, and death was waiting at the door. His mother had labored for hours, her body trembling with exhaustion and fear. Outside the clinic, the wind howled through bare trees, and the snow fell like ash from the sky. But inside, time stood still. When the final push came, and the room held its breath for a cry that never came, I was already speaking to his spirit, already fighting for the breath he could not yet take. He came into the world silent, still, blue. The hands of the midwife trembled. The nurse turned away. For a moment, the room was flooded with a quiet despair that only those who've watched life slip away can recognize. There was a clock ticking somewhere on the wall, counting the seconds that felt like centuries. Michael's father gripped the metal rail of the hospital bed, his knuckles white, whispering prayers he hadn't prayed in years. They thought it was over before it had begun. But I am not bound by beginnings or endings. I saw Michael before his mother knew his name. I had already written his life. Across eternity, not with ink or flesh, but with purpose, I had chosen him, and though death had come to steal him on the very threshold of life, I stepped forward and said, "No, not today." I moved toward the nurse and placed a weight on her heart. She didn't know why she tried again, only that she had to. With hands she doubted, she lifted his tiny body and breathed hope into lungs that had never opened. One breath, then another. I placed my hand over his chest, and the silence shattered. A cry rang out that startled the room like thunder splitting the heavens. He was alive. I smiled. Heaven rejoiced. The father fell to his knees and wept like a man who had seen a miracle, because he had. There are moments in time where eternity brushes the edge of human experience, and this was one of them. No cameras captured it. No headlines wrote about it. But in the quiet chaos of that little room, I marked it as sacred. This was not just a birth. It was a rescue. A battle fought and won before a single word was spoken, and no one would ever know how close the enemy had come to winning. Michael would never remember it, not with his mind. but his spirit would carry the echo of that moment for the rest of his life. That first breath, the breath I gave, would become the symbol of every breath I would later preserve. He would laugh, run, fall, and rise 1,000 times. But it all began here, in the silence where I stood guard between death and destiny. I did not save him because he earned it. I saved him because I loved him. Before his eyes ever opened, I had already called him mine, and from that first heartbeat to his last, he would never be out of my reach. There would be days he would doubt me, moments he would drift far from the sound of my voice, but still, I would be closer than the air in his lungs. As the years passed, Michael would grow strong, curious, stubborn, and kind. He would laugh loud and dream wide. And yet, the same hands that held him on that fragile morning would hold him through pain, through danger, through every dark hour yet to come. What began in the stillness of that room would ripple through a life full of narrow escapes and grace-drenched turns. This was only the beginning. What Michael didn't know, and what I always did, was that this life of his, this one fragile, beautiful life, would be filled with moments when death would come close. But so would I. Again and again, I would be there. Because I'm faithful. Because I am Emmanuel, God with him. And I was never letting go. He was 8 years old the first time fear truly gripped his heart. That kind of fear, the cold, breathless kind, doesn't come from the dark or from monsters under the bed. It comes from the sudden realization that you are small, fragile, and alone against something much bigger than you. On that spring afternoon, Michael learned what it meant to be powerless. But he also learned something else. I was there. The river ran high that year. Winter had been long and heavy. With snow, and now the melted waters rushed with urgency down from the mountains, roaring through the canyons and farmland like a living thing. The banks had swollen, the current had quickened, and though it was beautiful, it was dangerous. Michael didn't understand that. To him, it was just another place to explore with his older brother, just another secret adventure in the woods behind their family's land. They laughed as they tossed rocks, balancing on slippery stones and daring each other to get closer to the edge. The air was full of sunlight and new leaves, of childhood and invincibility, but joy turned to terror in a single misstep. One foot slid, one shoe lost its grip, and suddenly he was gone, swallowed by the river. I saw it before it happened, and I moved. The water was ice-cold and wild. It dragged him under like it had been waiting for him. He couldn't scream. He couldn't fight. His small body twisted in the current, bumping against sharp rocks and tangled branches. No one saw him fall. His brother was still laughing, unaware. His mother was miles away, washing dishes at the sink, humming softly to herself. But I saw. I always see. I whispered to a man upstream, a fisherman who had come out that day with no intention of fishing. He had almost stayed home, but something told him to go. That something was me. I stirred his heart to look downstream, to see a flash of red, a small hand, a flailing movement that would have gone unnoticed by anyone else. But not him. Not this time. The man dropped his rod and ran. He didn't know who the boy was. He only knew that he had to move. I gave his legs strength, his eyes clarity, and his timing precision. As Michael's lungs filled with water and panic overtook his body, the man dove in. The current pulled hard. It always does, but I pushed against it. I guided his arms. And just before Michael slipped beneath the surface for what would have been the final time, strong hands reached him. He was coughing and gasping when they made it to shore, muddy, shivering, and blue-lipped but breathing. His small frame trembled as the man wrapped him in his jacket. No one said much. There weren't words for what had just happened. The brother arrived, panicked. The man nodded, said he just happened to be there. But I knew better. There is no just in my story. Michael never forgot that river. For years he feared deep water. But even more deeply, in a place he couldn't name, he carried the memory of being caught, saved, rescued when no one else was watching. He never remembered the man's name, but I do. I wrote it down, and in heaven every act of obedience shines brighter than gold. The river did not take him, though it tried. Though it came with force and fury, I held him back, not because he had earned my protection, but because my love is not earned, it is given, and it was not yet time. Michael had more to live, more to become. So I carried him out, wet and coughing, but whole, and I kept walking with him. Through the woods, through the years, because every step of his life mattered to me, not just the dramatic rescues, but the quiet ones too. You see, love doesn't leave. Love stays, and I had every intention of staying. He was 16, with a heart full of fire and a head full of dreams. That kind of age is beautiful, wide open and reckless, bursting with the thrill of freedom and the illusion of control. It was the night of his first real date, and Michael had never felt so alive. He had washed his truck twice that day. He had rehearsed what he'd say and changed his shirt 3 times, and through all of it, I watched him with the tenderness of a father who delights in every detail. The sky had turned soft and golden as he drove her home, laughter bouncing between the dashboard and the windows rolled halfway down. For a few brief hours, the world was kind. For a few precious moments, Michael believed everything would be okay forever. But the world is not always kind, and not every driver on the road is sober. What Michael couldn't see was that around the next bend, danger was coming straight toward him, without lights, without warning, and without mercy. He was approaching a 4-way intersection on a country highway, familiar and quiet. The light turned green. He accelerated, humming the last song they'd played on the radio. And then it came. The roar of tires on gravel, the blur of a speeding truck running a red light. It wasn't just fast. It was impossible. The impact should have crushed him. The front of his vehicle was directly in the path of steel and glass and momentum, and in that single, breathless moment, I moved. With the touch of eternity, I shifted the front of his truck, just inches, just enough for the worst of the blow to hit the engine, not the cabin. The collision was still violent. Metal twisted, glass exploded, the world turned sideways. But Michael lived. He would say later that it all felt like slow motion, like time had bent itself around him. That's because it had. When the truck stopped spinning and the dust settled, Michael was in a ditch. Smoke drifted from the hood, and his wrist throbbed with pain. But he was breathing, conscious, alive. His date was shaken but untouched. The other driver, intoxicated and unaware, was pulled from his wreck with barely a scratch, and I stood there in the middle of it all, invisible but real, holding back what should have been fatal. He cried that night. Not from pain, but from shock. In the hospital waiting room, he kept staring at his hands, as if trying to understand how they were still attached to him. His father said it was luck. The paramedic said it was a miracle. And I wanted so badly for Michael to hear my voice whispering, "It was me." But the noise of grief and relief and paperwork drowned it out. Still, I stayed. This would be one of many moments where he would question why he lived. Not out of guilt, but out of wonder. Why me? That question echoed in his soul more than once over the years. And though I didn't always answer in words, I answered with presence. I answered with mercy. I answered with breath, with time, with more days than he ever expected to see. Some scars would remain. His wrist would ache in the winter, and the sight of headlights in his peripheral vision would always make his heart race just a little faster. But I used even those scars to remind him he had been spared. Not because he deserved it, but because I still had things for him to do, people for him to love. roads to travel that had not yet been walked. This was not the last time death would come for him in a moment of quiet. But each time I stood between him and the end, not to make his life easy, but to make it purposeful. I never promised he wouldn't suffer. I only promised he wouldn't be alone. That night on the road, when the world spun and steel screamed and angels stood on the edges of time, Michael was mine, and I would not let go. There was still so much ahead. Joy and failure, questions and grace. But for now, Michael drove again, tentatively with hands that trembled and eyes that scanned every intersection. And though he didn't know it, I was there in the passenger seat, whispering, "I've got you. Keep going. I'm not done with you yet." He was 23, and his hands were already worn by the rhythm of honest work. Michael had grown into a man with a quiet strength, one that didn't need to prove itself. He lived close to the land, close to his family, and even closer to the things he couldn't quite name, things like loyalty, duty, and love that cost something. The barn was more than just a structure to him. It was memory. It was legacy. It was his father's pride. And in the silence of dawn, it became the place where death nearly reached him again. The day had started like any other. He rose early, fed the animals, and repaired a section of the fence that had split under the weight of a storm. The air still smelled like rain, but in the rafters of the old barn, a loose wire had been slowly fraying, silent, unnoticed, waiting. When the spark finally came, it came without warning. One flicker, one breath of dry hay. Then the world turned orange. Michael didn't see it at first. He was out by the trough when he smelled the smoke. He ran without thinking, boots pounding against wet earth, heart already burning ahead of the flames. Inside the barn, the cattle cried out, confused, trapped. Smoke was already thick in the air. Flames licked the wooden beams like hands tearing through paper, and he didn't hesitate. He ran straight in. He would never remember how he held his breath. He would never be able to explain how he moved through the choking smoke, how he found the gates in the dark, or how he calmed the panicked animals long enough to lead them out one by one. But I remember, because I was there, breathing strength into his lungs and clarity into his thoughts. Fire raged around him, but my hand covered him. When the last calf turned toward the open door, the ceiling groaned. Michael looked up to see the support beam above him split and begin to fall. In that moment, time tightened again. Heaven held its breath. He had seconds, less than seconds. I reached for him. I whispered to his muscles, "Move now!" He dove. The beam crashed behind him, burying the spot where he had stood just moments before. He collapsed outside, coughing, blackened by smoke, eyes burning. But he was alive. His father knelt beside him, hands shaking, weeping, not for the barn that was gone, but for the son who was spared. The fire crew came too late to save the building, but not too late to witness the miracle. One firefighter told him, "You shouldn't have made it out." Michael only nodded, too tired to speak, but somewhere deep inside, he knew. Someone pulled me through. In the days that followed, he struggled with the loss. That barn had been built by his grandfather. Every board held history. Ashes now covered what once stood, tall and proud. But in those ashes, something holy lingered, a whisper, a presence, the quiet certainty that death had come close again and had been turned away. Michael never spoke much about that night. He wasn't the kind of man to exaggerate, but something in his eyes changed. He carried a reverence after that, a stillness that only comes from standing at the edge of the grave and walking back untouched. His hands would build again, his family would recover, but his spirit would never forget. The fire, and the one who walked with him through it. There are moments when my miracles don't roar, they breathe. They hide inside the instinct to run back in, inside the strength to hold on a little longer, inside the leap that lands just shy of tragedy. That night, Michael didn't see me, but I was the space between the flames. I was the whisper in the smoke. I was the shield between him and death, and I was never going to let him fall alone. The fire did not claim him, because I had written more days for him, and they were waiting just beyond the smoke. He was 31, strong in body, steady in his work, and quietly carrying the weight of a life that had seen too much and said too little. Michael had grown into a man others could lean on. He helped without being asked. He listened without judgment, and though he laughed easily, there was something guarded behind his eyes, a man who had learned that not everything in life comes with warning. That truth found him again one summer. Night in a way that nearly took him from this world. He had gone to visit a friend, just an ordinary evening in a small California town where people leave their doors unlocked and the air smells like cut grass and diesel. They sat on the porch, watching the sun dip below the hills, sharing stories and silence in equal measure. Michael had a habit of showing up when people needed him most, and that night was no different. What he didn't know was that a storm was forming just a few blocks away. Not in the sky, but in the soul of another man. There had been an argument, a bitter, volatile fight between two neighbors. Anger exploded. Someone grabbed a gun. The shouting turned to threats, and then a shot rang out. One bullet, fired in rage, with no aim, no control, just pain looking for a place to land. That bullet traveled farther than it should have. It tore through the night air like a ghost, and it was headed directly toward Michael. He was standing, laughing at something his friend had said when I turned his body. Just a small shift, one step forward, a change in posture he wouldn't even remember. The bullet struck the edge of the wooden post behind him and shattered into fragments. One shard grazed his shoulder, drawing blood but not harm. The rest splintered into the porch rail. He spun around, confused. No one knew where the sound had come from. No one yet knew how close death had just passed. I knew. The shooter was later found, disarmed, remorseful, but the damage he might have caused had already been erased, because I was there. Not in a way the news would report, not in a miracle the world could photograph, but in the precise timing of a breath, a step, a laugh that interrupted the trajectory of death. You see, not all my interventions are loud. Some are written in inches, and I never miss. Michael didn't sleep that night. He sat in the quiet, looking at the dried blood on his shirt, his thoughts heavy. He hadn't seen his life flash before his eyes. He hadn't cried, but something inside him shifted. He realized again, life is fragile, so easily taken, so quickly changed. And yet he was still here. The bullet didn't find him, but I did. I always do. He would keep the shirt, never wash it, not as a trophy, but as a reminder, not of fear, but of faith. He didn't speak about that night for a long time, not because he was trying to forget, but because he was trying to understand why it mattered so much, why he had been spared again. And I whispered to him, in that silence, because your story isn't finished, because I'm not done. There are no accidents in my design. Even in the dark, I orchestrate light. Even when danger is fired blindly into the air, I see its path, and I shield what must be protected. That night, Michael was not just a survivor. He was a testimony. And though no crowd had gathered to applaud it, heaven rejoiced at the sound of his heart still beating. The bullet did not take him, and not because it missed, but because I stood in its way. Because I knew the lives he had yet to touch, the grace he had yet to carry, the years still waiting to unfold. And so, once again, I whispered to death, not tonight. He was 44, and by now Michael had learned that the world doesn't slow down just because you grow tired. He carried the aches of age in his back and the wisdom of experience in his soul. Life hadn't gotten easier, but he had grown stronger. Steadier. He found peace in the hills, in the smell of pine, in the sound of boots on dirt trails, far from the noise of the world. That's why he hiked when he could. It wasn't just about exercise, it was communion. And I met him there, as I always did, in the quiet places. It was late October when he ventured into the mountains near Lassen Volcanic National Park, where the air was sharp and the skies were high. He went alone, not out of loneliness, but out of trust. He knew those trails well. He packed light, confident in the forecast, which had promised a clear window, before winter's breath began to bite. But the mountain doesn't answer to forecasts, and neither does life. Halfway into his hike, the wind shifted. The sky, once bright, began to darken. A storm formed over the peaks faster than the radar had predicted. Thick clouds swallowed the horizon, and snow began to fall, first lightly, then with a fury that shocked even the forest. Temperatures dropped in minutes. Visibility vanished. And Michael, miles from shelter, was suddenly wrapped in white and silence, alone, vulnerable, in danger. He pressed on, instincts sharpened by experience, but the trail disappeared beneath the snow. Every direction looked the same. His compass faltered. The map was useless. He stumbled. He yelled. No answer. The storm grew louder, mocking his strength. The cold pierced through his jacket like knives, and in that moment of helplessness, when every logical thought said this could be the end, he called my name. Not out loud, not with perfect faith, but in his heart. A whisper formed deep in his chest, shaped by fear and longing. Jesus, help me. And I heard him. I sent a wind, a strange one, not chaotic like the storms, but focused. It pushed him gently but firmly to his right. He wouldn't understand why he turned. He would only know that something told him this way, so he obeyed. Step by step, with frozen hands and a fading pulse, he followed what he couldn't see, but somehow trusted. That path led him to the side of an old ranger's shelter, long, unused but still standing, a door, a roof, safety. He collapsed inside, shaking uncontrollably, unable to build a fire, but shielded from the wind and the snow. There was enough insulation, enough stillness, enough warmth in the walls to preserve him through the night. I stayed with him, kneeling beside him as his consciousness faded, placing peace on his heart like a blanket. I kept his breath steady. I held back the cold. He didn't see me, but he felt me. I made sure of it. When morning broke, the storm had passed. A search party, alerted by a concerned neighbor who had noticed his truck still parked at the trailhead, found him asleep on the wooden floor, weak but alive. They marveled at the shelter, how intact it had been, how perfectly positioned it was in the path he never meant to take. But I had meant for him to take it. That detour was no accident. Michael never told many people about that night, not because he doubted it, but because he didn't have the words. How do you explain? The voice that isn't a voice, the hand that guides without being seen, but I know what he felt, I know what he feared, and I know what I did. I saved him. Not because he was perfect, but because I loved him. Because he asked, because I could. The mountain didn't claim him, though it tried. Though the storm rose with fury, I held it back, because his story wasn't over. Not yet. He was 52. By then, Michael had become a man of quiet courage and unwavering grace. His hands bore the history of everything he'd built, fences, friendships, a family marked not by perfection, but by love that endured storms. He had lived fully, not because life had been easy, but because he had refused to let hardship steal his wonder. And every time death had come close before, I had stood between them. But this time I did not stop it, because I had already set the hour. This time, it was not the enemy. It was my invitation. Michael had not been sick for long. The diagnosis came without warning. a rare condition, silent and swift. He wrestled with it, not out of fear of dying, but out of the sorrow of leaving those he loved. That was his greatest ache, not pain in his body, but the thought of his absence. Even in his final days he served others, writing notes of encouragement, blessing his sons, holding his wife's hand like it was the first time. Every moment became sacred, every breath a prayer. And I was closer than ever, not as the distant saviour he called on in storms, but as the shepherd who now walked him home. I sat with him in the stillness, when no one else was in the room. I caught every tear, even the ones he refused to let fall. I whispered truths to him in the night. You are not leaving life. You are coming to fullness. You are not being taken. You are being received. On the morning it happened, the house was filled with sunlight. Not the kind that blinds, but the kind that wraps around you like a promise. His breathing was slow, his eyes distant. He could hear voices, his wife humming a hymn in the kitchen, his daughter reading a psalm by the window. He was aware of their nearness, and yet something greater pulled him forward. He wasn't afraid, he wasn't alone, because I was already holding him. When he took his last breath, the world did not shatter. It grew still, gentle, holy. Heaven opened, not with thunder but with welcome. The veil between time and eternity grew thin, and I reached out my hand, not to rescue him from death, but to fulfill what I had promised all along, life without end. In that instant, Michael stepped into a glory he could never have imagined, and every wound, every scar, every ache dissolved into joy. He was home. I showed him the stories he had forgotten, the lives he had touched, the prayers he thought I hadn't heard, the moments he nearly gave up, and how I held him together from within. He saw the angels who had stood guard through every fire, every road, every storm. He understood why I said, "Not." Yet all those times, and he wept, not in sorrow but in overwhelming awe. There was no more fear, no more striving, just presence, just light, just me. I had walked with him through childhood and war zones of emotion, through laughter and hospital rooms, through falling beams and misfired bullets. And now I walked with him into the kingdom, prepared for him before the foundations of the world. This was always the destination, not the end, but the beginning. The ones he left behind would grieve. Yes, but even in their sorrow, I would be near. Because the story of Michael doesn't end in the ground, it rises in the lives he changed, in the son who now prays with conviction, in the neighbor who found hope again, in the barn rebuilt with stronger beams, and in the memory of a man who, every time death tried to reach for him, found me standing in the way until I called him to myself. This was not tragedy. This was triumph. And I welcomed him, arms open wide, voice full of joy. Well done, my son. You made it. Welcome home. I am Jesus Christ, the one who walked with Michael from his very first breath to his very last. I was there in the silence of his childhood, in the roar of the fires, in the stillness of the mountains, in the chaos of bullets and brokenness. Every time death reached for him before his time, I stood in the way. Not once, not twice, but again and again, because his story was still being written, because I had numbered his days, and no force on earth or in hell could take him before I said, "Now." He did not die by accident, nor by the hand of sickness, nor by the randomness of this world. He died on the day, in the month, and in the year I had chosen, before he was ever formed in his mother's womb. July 8th, 2025. Not a moment too early, not a breath too late. He did not fall, he was called, and he answered because he knew my voice. Michael was not a perfect man, but he was mine. He loved, he struggled, he believed, he questioned, he endured. He learned to Trust me, even when he couldn't see me. And when the time was right, I didn't rescue him from death. I brought him through it, into life that never ends, into a joy that no suffering can touch. He lives now in my arms, forever. No more pain, no more fear, no more shadows, just light and peace and the reward I prepared for him long ago. Because I am faithful, because I keep my promises, because I finish what I begin. Michael's story is not over. It echoes now in eternity, and I will tell it again and again for all of heaven to hear.